All right. Good afternoon. I'm calling this public hearing to order at 4:33 p.m. In accordance with the Building Emissions Reduction Disclosure Ordinance regulations adopted pursuant to the Building Emissions Reduction Disclosure Ordinance, Boston City Code Ordinance Section 7-2.2, the BERDO Review Board will hold a virtual public hearing at 4:30 on June 10th to review the following topics in regard to the reduction of greenhouse gases from building energy production and consumption so as to promote the public health and welfare of Boston residents. In accordance with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, we are conducting this public meeting online. To ensure public access to the deliberations of the BERDO Review Board, the public may access this call through telephone and video conferencing. Members of the public will have an opportunity to ask questions and provide public comment. To do so, please raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. If you are calling in and cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Send your questions to staff via email at berdoreviewboard@boston.gov. For the record, I am Stephen Ellis, acting chair of the board. I will now conduct a roll call of board members. Board members, please say your name in the order that they appear on the screen.
Rashida Boyd.
Stephen Ellis.
Yvette Jacob.
Jack Nelson.
Staff will now introduce themselves.
Aiden Callan, a BERDO program manager.
Diana Vasquez, BERDO Review Board Manager.
Ziggy Chin, BERDO Review Board Assistant.
Here is the agenda for today's meeting. We'll start with the approval of meeting minutes. The Environment Department staff will present updates on BERDO reporting, the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund, and any administrative updates. After that, RDH will be kicking off a training for the review board. Finally, we'll adjourn. First on the agenda is to approve the previous meeting minutes from May 13th. Are there any questions or comments regarding the meeting minutes? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
On the motion to approve meeting minutes, board members in favor say aye or show your hands. Aye.
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 Okay. I believe that with all the ayes, so the motion passes. We have now approved the meeting minutes. For the second agenda item, we will hear from the Environment Department about updates on the BERDO reporting.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Stephen. So I think last I checked in on these items was about a month ago. It was, the week before the big, BERDO reporting deadline of May 15th. And I provided an update just really on extension requests. So I wanted to give an update there, as well as where the status is on the BERDO reporting in terms of compliance by building. And then on the next slide, get a little bit more into what our outreach efforts are to up those compliance numbers over the next few months and continue to engage building owners that have not yet been engaged in this process. So just an update on reporting extensions. So, there are just under 6,000 buildings covered under BERDO. So about 10% of that had requested extensions, which were approved. And I've noted the breakdown here. So these are 3-month extensions. They have until August 15th, as opposed to May 15th to finish reporting. So we'll be working with them to make sure over the next few months that they're getting across the finish line here. But just a breakdown of the reasons for why building owners were not able to get their data in by May 15th. In some cases, they were waiting on us to complete reporting. We're working with a lot of different building owners on a lot of different scenarios, and especially around May 15th, our number of inquiries increased quite significantly. So, in those cases, we do enable building owners to note that they were just simply waiting on us to complete that reporting. While vast majority of BERDO buildings had to verify their data back in 2022 based on 2021 data, those that are new to BERDO this year, or those that are not new to BERDO this year, but they're reporting for the very first time this year, are still having to engage that third-party verifier for the first time. And so, because they're, at the liberty of the verifier's timeline, oftentimes that it gets over to them in a time frame where they're not able to get that all set by the 15th. So just noting that, so we have 77 in that bucket. A majority of these extension requests noted that utilities were not able to provide data in time. In addition to the, just back and forth with utilities that some, more complicated circumstances might require, and just in terms of accessing whole building data, perhaps, the building owner's going out to get release forms from a commercial tenant, and it's just taking more time. There is another circumstance of the utilities this year actually changing their account numbers, and some of their internal systems, which are just causing a bit more of a backlog on the utility side. So just want to note that some building owners at this time are just dealing with those internal process changes. I think some of us may have received a letter in the mail that Eversource and National Grid have both changed their account numbers recently. So just a lot of internal administrative items that are causing these utility requests to perhaps take a bit more time in some cases. And then other reasons that we've allowed for 121 in that bucket. But in some cases, we have denied those requests, because they simply didn't provide an answer that we were noting was an extenuating circumstance. So just noting that the number stood at 35. I mentioned this last month, but I'll mention it again. We're not finding those folks right away. We're saying, look, just get your data in as soon as possible. We'll continue to work with you. Your circumstance doesn't meet the extenuating circumstances that we've outlined. And while we do reserve the right to issue fines, we're a long ways away from that, given the number of notices that we would have to send out ahead of that. So just making sure that when we do deny folks for not providing a comprehensive reason, that we're noting that as well. And then so just an update on where our reporting numbers stand. So we have just under 50% of the buildings are submitted, whether that be they're fully in compliance or they've submitted to us, but they tripped some sort of data quality flags that warrant some further back and forth to make sure that, the data that they've reported, they're able to use and plan for with confidence. And so that pending revisions, bucket that we'll put a lot of buildings in before we fully put them into compliance, is a necessary back and forth just to make sure that nothing's getting through the cracks and we're able to plan with confidence with this data. But we have just under 3,000 buildings that have not yet submitted. And so, I will note that, just about 400 of those buildings are Boston Housing Authority at this time. Boston Housing Authority has, been having some trouble getting their data in a timely manner. And we're working with them to make sure that they're getting that in as soon as possible. We fully expect them to be across the finish line within the next few weeks, but I did want to note that that is a sizable chunk of that. So I'll leave that there, and just expand upon what our game plan is over the next few months on the next slide. So, we are sending follow-up emails to BERDO account holders. Every BERDO account holder logs onto the BERDO reporting form, claims their building to say, I am the point of contact that's reporting on behalf of this building. And those are our primary points of contact when it comes to just reaching out for non-compliance and making sure that we're getting in touch with the right folks. So I do want to note that 71% of buildings have been claimed at this time. Just throwing those numbers up there. So that's 71% of buildings that have been claimed. That's a very different number than the around 50% that we're sitting at right now in terms of what's been reported. So there's a good sizable number of buildings that we have contact information for. We're either currently working with them right now, or we're going to be following up with them very consistently over the next few months to make sure that they're reporting their data. In addition to consistent follow-up emails, we'll be sending physical letters later this month to BERDO building owners that have not yet reported or requested a reporting extension. And I did want to note just an additional outreach effort that we're starting up here, door-to-door outreach. So this is something that we have quite a large covered buildings list, and it's we've felt that we've wanted to find other avenues of reaching out to the property managers, owners, beyond just going door to door to try to get proper address information, proper contact information. It's something that other cities employ that are going through this ordinance process as well. So we're in the planning stages of that, and intend to start trying that out later this month. But we're hopeful that that will allow for us to simply get better contact information when it comes to, okay, we see that the property management company for this building is this property management company, and so we know we can reach out to them. They may be working with BERDO in some other capacity, as many property management companies are, but they might not be aware that this particular building is covered under BERDO, for example. And so, yeah, we're gonna try this effort and see what this brings up. So, looking forward to getting some outdoor time this summer. But I think that's it from me. So happy to answer any questions on that.
Okay, thank you, Aidan. I will now ask each board member if they have any questions or comment. So over to you, Board Member Boyd.
About the housing, the 400 that you're waiting for, you said 400 were waiting. Is there anything, they're just dragging their feet, or is there anything that can be done to push them quicker, or it's just a waiting process?
Yeah, at this time, so they have about 600 buildings that they're reporting for. They receive their data from National Grid in an aggregate billing format that has caused them to have to request data from National Grid in a way that is different from almost everybody else. So that had taken some time initially, and their sort of starting date was, I think, pushed back quite a lot as a result of that. And we've been meeting with them bi-weekly to make sure that they are continuing to move things along, and that we're all holding each other accountable to deadlines that we're setting for ourselves and pushing the process along. So at this point, it's really just a matter of quantity that they're having to deal with, and so they're fully engaged, fully working with this. The data at this time, it's my understanding that it's all in Portfolio Manager and ready to submit. It's just a matter of wrapping up those BERDO reporting forms and getting those across the finish line. So yeah, we're fully engaged with them. We're just having to meet with them consistently to make sure that we're all on the same page and leading by example here. And, you know, so the city owned buildings, the municipal buildings are all across the finish line at this point. They've all been reported. It's really just a handful of those BHA ones that we're still waiting on.
Thank you, Aiden.
Yep.
Thank you, Board Member Boyd. So, Aiden, thank you for that presentation. You know, with the utility account changing happening between both the electric and the natural gas, or should I say Eversource and National Grid, I'm assuming that in order to make sure that everyone is still reporting appropriately, the third-party review process is going to be the point where they're making sure that all of these account numbers are appropriate. But if they are changing right now, that third-party review won't happen until most likely next year to verify that those account numbers line up. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the existing data requests that the building owners had put through initially are still active. So those are really tied to the meter number, which did not change. But but this account number change had caused both Eversource and National Grid to temporarily shut down their systems, to just have to plan administratively to handle these responses in a slightly different way. They just wanted to make sure that they were fully prepared to take on that account number switch. So we've been working with both of those utilities to make sure that it's a smooth transition, but it has caused a number of building owners to have to sit tight while that fix has gone through.
Got it. And thank you for that. And just out of curiosity, that roughly 1,600 buildings that have not been claimed, is this existing in any particular area of the city, or is it still the sort of subset of small buildings that we discussed last year?
Yeah, so I wish I had a bit more granular data in front of me here, but I can say that is they lean more towards the 2030 buildings, the smaller buildings that are newer to BERDO as of the last couple of years. Being smaller buildings, less likely to maybe have a property management company, or less likely to have the contacts, the sort of structure to more easily know about BERDO, in the first place. And so I think we're sending letters to all these building owners, but yeah, we know that we're going to have to work a bit harder and really try to get those smaller buildings on board, because we are seeing a disproportionate number of those unclaimed for the 2030. So of course they have a bit more runway, but we need to engage them as quickly as possible. So that is a kind of a clear trend that I see, just in terms of the size of the building, correlates with the square footage, and it correlates with the emissions that are actually engaged within BERDO. What you would hope to see is that if there is greater engagement in any one area, it's the larger buildings, the ones that are simply on average more responsible for a higher number of emissions. But beyond that, no clear indication of building use type from what I can see. It's the clearest trend is really just building size. So that's threshold, and that threshold is aligned with when building owners had to start reporting to BERDO in the first place. So building owners that are subject to 2025 likely had to start reporting back in 2017. So we've been engaging them for 7 years at this point.
Got it. Well, best of luck on the door-to-door outreach. That's some grassroots level work to be done right there, and I hope you work with the other CBOs in that process. And as we get closer to the August 15th deadline, or the extension request, I should say, I do look forward to see a breakout by maybe even types. I think the story about the size has been sort of it's been made very clear at this point after several years. And so I'm genuinely interested in the type of buildings that are realistically not even participating or maybe haven't been claimed, I should say. Thank you for that. All right, so now I'm going to pass it over to Board Member Jacobs.
Sorry, I had to go for my mute button. No questions or comments at the moment. I'm just following along. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Jacobs. Over to you, Board Member Nelson.
I have no questions. Good luck with the hitting the streets.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Okay, so we are now switching gears to discuss the updates on the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. I will hand it off to Diana.
Yes, I can give an update on the Equitable Emissions Investment Fund. So the fund has officially launched or opened on Friday, May 31st. Thanks to the board for voting and approving opening the fund. So just as a reminder, the board voted to award up to $750,000 with a deadline to apply by Friday, July 12th. So we have a new website. It is boston.gov/BERDO-fund, where we have all this information available. We have 2 information sessions planned. So one is tomorrow at 12 o'clock, and the next one is on June 20th from 10 to 11. They're both virtual. And we have registration links for anybody who's interested. The announcement and the website has been shared with the Environment Department's social media, with different community partners and our community advisory group members via this newsletter. So the BERDO newsletter and the review board newsletter, and to individuals who provided their emails in our public feedback form survey. So if they provided their email and stated that they wanted more information, we also reached out to them to let them know that the fund has officially been opened. And just as a reminder of the timeline, the fund opened on May 31st. Tomorrow we are here. Tomorrow we have an information session. June 20th, we have a second information session. And then the application deadline is July 12th. Of course, the board, when we passed it, asked for discretion to extend the deadline if the board felt that there were not enough applications submitted. But this is the timeline we're working. Excuse me. This is the timeline we're working with right now. So no major updates. We have 18 registered. We have 18 folks registered for the information session tomorrow. So it does seem that there is some interest. But other than that, the fund is out and available. And maybe Ziggy, if you don't mind, maybe you can share the link to the BERDO fund website if folks want to see it.
Thank you, Diana. I will now ask each board member if they have any questions or comments. I'll be going in reverse order. So Board Member Nelson.
Just one comment. One of my clients, who's a not-for-profit hospital, they're aware of it, and I think they're going to pursue some of the funds. So it seems as though the information is getting out there. No questions otherwise. Thanks.
That is great to hear. Thank you, Board Member Nelson. Over to you, Board Member Jacobs.
No questions or comments at the moment.
I share Board Member Nelson's sentiments that it does seem to have been out there. I think it's interesting how the social media piece was the ones that some of my colleagues, excuse me, I don't know where my accent was coming on for a second, but some of my colleagues were letting me know that they've noticed it and they will be attending some of the information sessions. So thank you for putting that out there. No questions for me at this time. And Board Member Boyd.
No comments. That social media was good advertisement, if you want to say that. Yeah, but no comment.
I'm glad to hear it.
Okay, thank you, Board Member Boyd. We will now cover in the administrative updates, so I'll be turning it over to you, Ziggy.
Hi. So a couple updates on the makeup of the board. We recently had 2 members step down, Lee Matsueda and Matt O'Malley. Matt O'Malley has been appointed to serve on the BPDA board by Governor Healy. We appreciate the time they both put in as members of the review board, and we wish them luck in their future endeavors. The BERDO team is working with the mayor's office to fill these vacancies as soon as possible. The regulations state that in the face of these absences, the mayor's office can select from existing pools of applicants, of the nominees, sorry. If the mayor does not select anyone from the existing pool, we can open a new nomination process. And there has unfortunately been no further updates on Hassan's nomination process, but we're working on getting him on the board as soon as possible. And as another update on the admin update, the BERDO team has updated the emissions factors, and the new ones can be found on the BERDO website. And I'll put the link in the chat to the new emissions factors. Also, a reminder, our next meeting is scheduled for June 24th.
Thank you, Ziggy. Before we get to public comment, I want to make sure to check in with the board here to see if there's any questions or comments about what was just mentioned under the administrative update. So I'll start with you, Board Member Boyd.
No comment.
All right, thank you, Board Member Boyd. I wish you all luck as you go through the process. I know it's been taking some time to get Hassan nomination process completed. And so from what I'm hearing, Ziggy, it sounds like you still have a pool of applicants that you can work with from the previous iteration of collecting nomination from those that were on the board from CBOs. So I'm glad to know that there are still some members that we can select from there. And I really do hope that the mayor's office may move a little bit faster on this. I understand we're in the middle of the budget period, and we're also facing the July 1st deadline coming up, where we will have a lot of work to do then. So best of luck in the outreach and getting this process completed. Board Member Jacobs.
Just to piggyback off of what you were saying, Stephen, I'm hoping to see some of these seats get filled. I do wish, the members the best of luck on their future endeavors, but it's clear and apparent that we are going to need some more input. I'm looking forward to that. That's all.
It may have been breaking up towards the end there for me. I'm not sure if it was the same for my colleagues on the line here, but I think I heard the majority of what you were saying on Board Member Jacobs about the sentiments on this board. So if you need to make another comment, please feel free to come off mute and at any moment. But for the time being, I'm going to go over to Board Member Nelson.
I heard that there's new emissions factors. Was there any significant change or update on those values?
Hi, this is Hannah. Sorry, I had just taken a bite of peanut M&M. So apologies for the crunching.
Sorry to interrupt.
There were no major changes. What we have for the emissions factors for the first time is we received the third-party verified emissions factors from our district energy providers. So that includes Vicinity and Maytap. So those are, we didn't have those before. We were just relying on the default factors provided by the EPA for district energy system, or like district steam and chilled water. Now we have plant-specific emissions factors that can be used for planning purposes. And then also we did our first annual emissions calculations for grid emissions factors. So every year the Environment Department will be calculating a grid emissions factor based on data from ISO New England, because ISO New England releases a final or an official emissions factor for the whole electric grid, but it's usually a couple of years delayed. So we're going through our own process of using the data they publish and calculating that. So we've released that as well. It was higher than the projected emissions factor. So if that were the case, say in 2025, the first emissions compliance year, we would be using the projected emissions factor rather than the actual calculated emissions factor. But we're going through that process now to start getting some practice and demonstrating kind of how those emissions factors may be different.
Did the value of greenhouse gases per M pound of steam. Did that emissions factor go up or down with the steam suppliers?
I'd have
Generally,
double check, but I believe they're lower than the EPA's default emissions.
okay, okay. So it's favorable for the users.
Yes.
Good. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Nelson, and thank you, Hannah, as well. We will now be open the meeting to public comment for the public to respond on any of the topics that they've heard today. As a reminder to members of the public, to provide public comment, please raise your hand or type in the chat in the application via the Zoom meeting platform. If you are calling in and cannot use the platform, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Your questions send your questions to staff via the BERDO Review Board email at boston.gov. So BERDO Review Board at boston.gov. Again, as a reminder, we are limiting questions to 3 minutes to ensure everyone has a chance to speak. We will also ask members of the public to introduce themselves and their neighborhood. We will now wait to give members of the public the opportunity to provide questions or comments. Hearing none, now RDH will conduct a basics of building science training. So I will now hand it over to RDH.
Great, thank you.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Bailey, I was gonna say, did you have what you needed? Are you good to screen share?
Yes, let me just make sure I can screen share here. All right. Can everyone see that slide okay? Blue slide with some text on it.
Looks great.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Give me just one moment to set up here, folks. My apologies. I'd like to keep an eye on the chat here. All right. Well, thank you for having us today. My name is Bailey Brown. I'm with RDH Building Science, and I'll be facilitating our session today for review board training. Our first session today is, oh, sorry. Let me get. Okay, there we go. As a reminder, our session today is for educational and training purposes only, so we might be talking about various compliance methods and other opportunities. However, that is general discussion for education. And so if you need assistance in applying any of our discussion today to individual projects or portfolios, please reach out to the department or RDH or the review board. So I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you for joining today. A bit about what to expect from today. As mentioned, this is a recorded public session. We do have a few non-board members, it appears, joining the session. We've got the department as well as some folks from RDH on the call today. The review board is our primary audience for today. So we'll primarily be focusing our activities and questions with the review board. If there are other questions that need to be asked, there is an email available, the BERDO review board at boston.gov. We will be using Zoom pretty simply here, simple hand raise chat features. We do ask that everyone have their mic muted unless they come off mic to ask a question or contribute to any sort of discussion. And then I'd like to encourage that have cameras on if available and if appropriate, just to enrich the learning opportunity for everyone here today. Today is intended to be informal and collaborative. We're going to ask for review board engagement. You all have a lot of wonderful experiences and knowledge already that we can learn from and share with everyone on the call today. So I encourage everyone to join in if they can. And we'll be looking at a fair bit of information today and having a lot of discussion. We will have some key opportunities to have some group Q&A at the end of each kind of subsection of our information today. If you have a burning question and you would like it answered right away, go ahead and put your hand up. We're happy to answer that question as we move along here. Or if you are concerned about losing your question, feel free to drop it in the chat, and we can either collect it then or at the end of the subsection and make sure you get an answer. The department will be supporting us in delivering the recording of this, as well as the slide deck, so that you have that available after the session for reference. And I cannot see all of you in the Zoom platform. Maybe I can. Okay. So before we move on, let's just give the tools a quick test. So if everyone could, the review board could just give me a quick hand raise, just to test out that hand raise feature. I see one. Rashida's on her way. I see a physical hand. That works for me. Jack, okay. And we might have more. I've got, don't have visibility of all. Okay, it looks like everyone's finding that feature just fine. And let's give the chat a quick test as well. Anything, quick hello, anything you can drop in there just to get a bit more familiar with it. If anyone is having trouble finding those tools, we will be using those throughout the training. So if you're having trouble finding those tools, feel free to drop it in the chat, and one of us from RDH or the department can assist you in finding those. All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Okay, there we go. Thank you, folks. All right, we'll keep going from there. But again, if you need any support, please feel free to reach out, and we'll do our best to assist. All right, so a little bit about RDH, why we're here today. RDH is supporting the City of Boston Department of Environment and the Review Board with technical training, capacity building, on-call technical services, and developing some public education materials. So our efforts today are squarely focused on that technical training and capacity building need for the board. RDH is a North American building science-focused firm specializing in building enclosures, facade engineering, energy and climate, asset management, and research policy and training. We have a fairly deep bench supporting this project right now and kind of throughout the duration of 2024. But today you have the pleasure of hanging out with Steve and I. I'm the project lead and a building science specialist. Steve is a principal and senior energy and sustainability specialist who will be supporting a lot of our discussion today as well. So thank you to Steve for joining the group. All right, a bit about our training, because we haven't had an opportunity to talk with the board directly about our training plan. All of you participated in a questionnaire as well as interviews to provide us with learning up your learning preferences and learning needs, as well as some areas of technical knowledge that you wanted to have some growth in and focus on. And so with that, we took those materials and we developed a training plan that includes 3 different phases that will occur between now and the end of November of this year. And so those 3 phases, the first phase will actually occur right now, June to July. This is our first session of our first phase, which will include groundwork, just general groundwork that will serve as a foundation for the rest of our sessions and phases. So that occurs during this 90-minute public meeting. Our second session, which will focus on audits and beyond the building concepts, will occur on June 24th at the next hearing. And then the week of July 15th and the 22nd, we'll be breaking into small groups and doing some small cohort training of 3 to 4 individuals per group to focus on additional questions and information. And so currently we have not yet officially defined phase 2 and phase 3 topics. We have an idea of what those should be based off of the feedback that we received from everyone during the initial needs assessment process. But we would like to hear the questions and the feedback that comes from phase 1 before we set those in stone and move forward with developing the training for you. So our first session today is within phase 1. And so phase 1 is primarily going to focus on building science and policy fundamentals. I see a hand up. Stephen, do you want to jump in?
I just wanted to clarify. So Since we potentially have 3 new board members coming on, will you be doing a new assessment in order to reassess what phase 2 and 3 will look like for the board?
Correct. Yeah. Each member that joins the board will also go through a similar process as what the existing board members went through to collect their learning needs, as well as any technical kind of knowledge expansion areas that are also needed.
Thank you.
Our second focus for phase 1 training will be on energy audits. We'll also be looking at BERDO compliance methods and decision making. And then the fourth area will be looking at beyond the building concepts and talking about things like district energy systems, RECs, and PPAs. For our session today, given this is our first session, we'll be focused on primarily groundwork. So we'll focus on building systems and greenhouse gases and general BERDO compliance. Building systems will focus on just how the building functions as a system and the interaction of those subsystems together. We'll be defining different types of building-related carbon emissions and explaining why different buildings have different emission targets. We'll also be looking at building-specific factors that influence how a building might comply with BERDO. All right. Any questions before we jump into the technical training aspect of today? All right, we'll continue on. Okay, so for our building systems groundwork today, we can think of the building as a system. This is a very simple illustration that you'll see in some of the general public education materials for BERDO. Pretty much any building that would need to comply under BERDO has a similarity, and that's that the building functions as a system. So although this is kind of a simplification of a building, right, possibly a residential structure, maybe multifamily, this concepts apply to commercial as well as institutional projects and beyond. But the building as a system generally looks at the concept that there's external environment and loads. So we can think about solar loads, wind, rain, and snow, external influences on a building. There's the enclosure. The building enclosure, most simply put, is everything that keeps the outside out and the inside. So it's the boundary that forms the building, walls, roof, windows, and other elements that help manage things like rainwater and snow melt, air pressure differentials, thermal loads, so heating, cooling, heating loads possibly coming across the enclosure, and things like water vapor, which help reduce the risk of condensation and help support things like durability. The third subsystem of the building as a system concept is just internal environmental loads. So this could be related to occupant behaviors. It could be things like lighting, AV, everything that might be happening within the interior of the building that isn't necessarily part of those other systems. And then we have HVAC systems, so heating, ventilation, air conditioning. This would also include things like hot water distribution. And then a fifth system is on-site renewable energy. So this very simple illustration would be something like a solar array on top of. There may be other subsystems that these primary systems could be broken into, but generally the concept is that all of these systems have some way of working together to form the building as a whole system. So we have a bit of an activity here for you today, very brief, but up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see that I've listed the systems. So the external environment loads, building enclosure, internal environment loads, HVAC, on-site renewable energy. So this is the same illustration that we saw before, but we get a better glimpse at the annotations, the lettered annotations on the screen. This illustration is just simply kind of cut in the middle and enlarged for your viewing ability. So in order to perform this activity, it'll get us more familiar with some of the common components included within each system. And so for A here, we have a water heater. Go ahead and drop in the chat what system you think that might relate to. Hot water heater. So we've got our systems listed up in the upper hand corner here. Okay, the button for internal. And feel free to come off come off mic too if you'd like to contribute in that way. So hot water heating would actually be part of the HVAC system because it has to do with hot water and distribution. We would typically lump it under HVAC. So let's try another one, B and C, which would be the appliances. So we've got laundry appliances and cooking appliances. We think about B and C. Internal, okay. Yep, definitely internal. So internal environmental loads. Occupants have some control over, and yep, awesome. Okay. D and E, we have a heat pump here. And we also have a wall cassette shown on the inside of the building. So D and E. HVAC, yep, you've got it. All right, and then F for thermostat here. Seeing more HVAC, all right. And then G, this is lighting. So a bit difficult to tell as we've chopped this image in half, but we've got lighting here on G. Internal, awesome. Yep, you've got it. So controlled by the occupants, but part of those internal gains. And then H. H is showing a temperature differential across this boundary here. So hot to cold or cold to hot. Enclosure, yep. Very much so. So the enclosure controls those thermal loads transferring across that boundary to keep the outside out and the inside in. Awesome. And then I and J are also on which system? That's a window. I and J are representing a window. All right, enclosure, great. So windows are a main contributor in the enclosure system when we start talking about emissions. So they can contribute internal gains, so solar gains. They can also contribute to things like unintentional air leakage, which can impact the need for heating and cooling, and also relate to how much we need to provide ventilation or filtration air. All right, where were we? We didn't do K, let's do K. K is this yellow streak here indicating some sun on your building. External, correct, all right. And then L we talked about a little bit earlier. Renewable energy, yep, you've got it. And then M is indicating some sort of thermal insulation. Thermal insulation that would help reduce those loads. Enclosure, yep, all right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for playing along. Helps to break down these components so that we can get a better feel for which systems we might be talking about. And then I'm going to hand this off to Steve. He's going to be talking about an example building and looking at the energy demands, consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions and how those all connect with one another.
I had to clear my throat there for a second. Yeah, just want to demonstrate sort of just some bar charts, almost math, how these different parts of the buildings interact. So this is 2 bar graphs on the left. These are all the kind of indicating sort of a typical building where the heat losses are in the winter time. So we lose heat out the basement and below grade, or the slab on grade, we lose heat out the roof. On the far left side, we lose, as Bailey mentioned, we lose heat out the windows, we lose heat out the walls through infiltration. This is air leakage through the envelope. And then we have ventilation. We need to provide fresh air to improve the air quality inside the space for people. And so we lose heat when that ventilation air has to be exhausted. The bar on the right has to be the exact same size, same height. So all the heat losses are made up with heat gains if you're going to heat the building. And some of those heat gains are free. So internal gains is coming from lights, receptacles, anything you plug into the wall, and people. We're all little 100-watt light bulbs running around in the building. And you get some free heat from the windows through the solar gains. And then the rest in red, that's our thermal demand. That's how much heat we need to provide to the building from our furnace, from our boiler, or from our heat pump. Would you show the next Barbara? I think advance ahead. Yeah. And so that thermal heat, that thermal demand needs to provide, you need to consume energy to do it. So often it's natural gas. Soon it'll be more and more heat pumps in the Boston area, in Massachusetts. Domestic hot water is also a heat consumption. And then to move that heat around the building, you often need fans or pumps to move heat into the building from where it's being produced at the boiler and throughout the building. And of course, we need to use energy to operate the lights. We need to use energy to operate the receptacles, and so on. And so you can kind of see by following this through, if I have better windows with less heat loss, that means my thermal demand is going to be lower, and therefore my heating energy consumption is going to be lower. Or if I improve the solar gains by, the building is oriented to the south and it collects lots of free sunlight, that would also reduce the thermal demands. Ironically, internal gains by having more lights reduces your thermal demand, but of course you need electricity to run the lights. So usually in the balance of things, more lights is actually just more energy use overall. And if you want to bring on the next slide, and this one is just using your current emission rates for electricity and natural gas. How would that turn into emissions for the building? And right now, electricity is currently slightly dirtier, slightly more carbon per unit of energy than natural gas is. And so that's why we're showing that. You can see that the heating and the domestic hot water, which is coming from natural gas, shrinks a little bit, and everything else kind of got a little bit bigger. But that's going to change over time. Let's see the next slide or the next animation. So those electrical end uses, as your grid gets cleaner, are going to sort of shrink on their own. But also, if you had more efficient lights, switched everything to LED, more efficient fans, variable speed fans, variable speed pumps, more efficient cooling, less solar gains in the summertime to reduce the cooling load. Better lights reduces the cooling load as well. Or more insulation or more efficient heating systems that will reduce the GHG emissions associated with those gas uses, which is the ones in red. We're not expecting natural gas to get all by itself cleaner. Natural gas is just methane. There may be some renewable natural gas may show up on your gas grid eventually that'll lower those emissions, but the natural gas itself is expected to be pretty static in the future. So to kind of give you an idea of how all these things link together. And the other thing to keep in mind when it comes to real buildings is most of the systems in buildings do have a natural life cycle. They need to be replaced eventually. Unfortunately, they don't need to be replaced at the same time. They all have different life cycles. So if you go right into the middle of this table structure, the hope is the structure is going to last the lifetime of the building. The building's not going to suddenly fall down. May need to if it's a multifamily building, you may need to touch up the balconies every 40 years, but for the most part, the structure is going to stay. But mechanical systems like primary HVAC equipment, that's the second row from the top, boilers, chillers, rooftop units, they're going to need a little bit of maintenance every 5 to 10 years and typically need to be replaced every 15 to 25 years. Minor HVAC systems like pumps and fans, they tend to need to be replaced every 10 to 15 years. Windows often last 20 to 50 years, depending on the windows. Old single glaze windows can last a long time. The sealed unit, insulating glazing unit windows don't last quite as long. And the reason to bring this up is building owners that are looking to replace systems to be more efficient are usually timing these things to end of life. Because when you have to replace the window anyways, replacing it with a better window, I already have the cost of replacing the window. I just need to pay for the incremental cost of the better window. So they're usually just looking to replace things at those end of lives. Which is to say, most buildings, the building that can do a deep energy retrofit and replace everything all at once tends to be a unicorn. they tend to be quite unique. Most buildings are going to do a plan over time. So next slide. I guess we're going to stop there for questions.
Yeah, a quick break for questions. Any questions on the building as a system, subsystems, how those systems might work together? Okay, all right. Next, we're going to jump into the greenhouse gases groundwork. So when we're talking about reducing building emissions, we're actually talking about the goal of reducing greenhouse gases emitted from buildings. And carbon dioxide is the most commonly emitted greenhouse gas related to building energy sources. So there are other greenhouse gases that we'll hear about, things like methane, nitrous oxide, or fluorinated gases. But really, when we look at building emissions, we're focused on reducing carbon emissions. And so Steve's now going to talk about how we can frame buildings and carbon and what that relationship looks like.
Yeah. So this is kind of the diagram of all the carbon related to building and operating a building. But BERDO is really focused on the last two. So embodied carbon, there is carbon related to the construction of a building. There's carbon related to making concrete, making steel, making insulation. And this is all carbon that's emitted before the building is even occupied. And probably in about 10 more years, you're going to be seriously looking at this too, because as we start improving everything else, the embodied carbon of new buildings becomes more important. But right now, BERDO is focused on operational carbon and avoided emissions. In particular, operational emissions come in direct and indirect emissions, often and more commonly universally called Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And then avoided emissions are any renewable energy installed on a building, purchase, power agreement, carbon offsets, and things like that. Next slide. So as I already mentioned, in the chat.
Sorry, Steve, we were going to take a brief pause here in the chat.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. So we wanted to do another activity with everybody. So drawing on what we learned about building systems just a few minutes ago and your own experiences, we'd like to hear from everyone, if we can, some examples of what causes building emissions. So where are those emissions coming from in the building? So one example would be heating and cooling our indoor spaces. So this is really kind of just a brainstorming session. If you'd rather come off mute and share your ideas, totally fine as well, or you can drop them in the chat.
Well, you said the major ones, which is heating and cooling. Electricity, is the other one that one can add. I know we're not getting into Scope 3, so I'll avoid that for now. So,
right, you're setting us up well for our next slide there, Stephen. So, our goal in just having this kind of mini brainstorm session is starting to think about where these emissions come from. And there's various ways that we can compartmentalize those emissions, and there's some good feedback here. So, gas stoves and cooking and various aspects of the enclosure have an impact on how much energy we use. Claudia brought in boilers as an example. On-site renewable has a contribution as well. So these are some great feedback here.
it's a very rare one, but refrigeration for certain commercial buildings is another one, or sort of any construction company that has refrigeration on site. So that might be a whole very specific one. So there we go.
Yeah, that's a great point, Stephen.
Yeah. Yes. Some refrigerants are greenhouse gases themselves. Actually, quite a few. We call that would be part of Scope 3, and we call them fugitive emissions. Great name.
All right, good segue. Steve, you want to jump in on various scopes?
Yeah, so we've already heard this, already mentioned scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. BERDO is concerned about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are probably the easiest to understand. If the chimney or the tailpipe from whatever you're burning is in your building, that's scope 1. So any fossil fuel you're burning in your building to provide space heating, or domestic hot water, that's scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are energy you consume in your building, but the tailpipe or the chimney is not in your building. So somewhere out there in Massachusetts, someone is burning natural gas to turn a magnet and make electricity, and you are consuming that electricity, but the tailpipe is at that generating station. But because you're consuming the electricity, you are counting that scope 2 emissions. Now, your scope 2 emissions are somebody else's scope 1 emission. So that person at that generating plant, that's their scope 1 emission. But we're going to call it your scope 2 emission because it's indirect to you. And then scope 3 emissions are energy use. And I said BERDO doesn't count those at all. But any energy use related to operating the business in the building. So if it's a consulting office, we track our commuting, we track our business flights and things like that. We could also track anything we purchase, the embodied carbon related to paper, the embodied carbon related to our phones and our laptops and things like that. But that scope 3 is not included in BERDO. And then downstream of your activities, you can create scope indirect emissions for things that you produce. If I'm actually a factory making light bulbs, then there's embodied carbon for those light bulbs. So again, my scope 1 emissions or scope 2 emissions can become somebody else's scope 3 emissions by consuming the very things that I'm producing in my business. Next slide. So just kind of an example, and this example here could be for a district energy system or for the electrical system. So we'll call it the electrical system. They have an energy source to generate electricity from. They got to convert that chemical energy in fossil fuels and natural gas and convert that into electrical energy. And in doing so, they emit their scope 1 emissions, and then they have to transmit that to you over the power lines, and then finally it gets to your building where you consume that electrical energy. So there's a direct connection all the way back to where those emissions and where that fossil fuel was consumed. Similarly, it could be a district energy plant on a university campus, and they're using fossil fuels at that campus plant. They're distributing hot and or cold water throughout the or steam throughout the campus, and that's being distributed to the individual buildings where they consume or they use that energy to heat the buildings. Next slide. In terms of electrical emissions emissions in the Massachusetts grid, you can see the big green chunk of the pie is natural gas. That's by far your number 1 source of emissions for making electricity. The number 2 source of power is actually solar, but solar is 0. It's in one of those zeros at the top of the pie chart. So it's got 0 emissions associated with it. And then we got some minor other ones that's generating power on the Massachusetts grid, and they make up the other 25% of the total emissions associated with the grid in Massachusetts. And again, this is cleaning up. That green piece of pie is being displaced with more solar. It's being displaced with more wind, and hopefully other things as well as time goes on. Next slide. I had to fix, literally, Bailey, I had to fix this math mistake while you were talking on this graph. I had a little metric IP conversion error. I'm in Toronto. So this is your grid over time. The blue line is your projected grid emissions over time. And when it gets below into the green area, which is going to happen somewhere around 2029, that's when heat pump heating is going to start emitting less carbon than burning natural gas in your own buildings. So that's going to happen fairly quickly in about 3 or 4 years. And projecting that all the way out to 2049, if all this happens and comes true and these emissions on the electrical grid keep reducing, even electric resistance heating will produce less carbon than burning natural gas in the building. So this is why electrification is becoming such a big deal. It is far easier to create clean electricity than it is to create clean fuels and distribute clean fuels to buildings for space heating. So there's going to be a lot of electrification happening to decarbonize some of these buildings. Next slide. And this is just a case study of what some of the reporting buildings are going to be thinking about as they try to create these plans over time to decarbonize their buildings. So this is a case study I worked on. We called it the Amoeba building. It wasn't a straight line anywhere. I'm not even the hallways were straight in this building. But next slide. And basically, we say every building needs a plan. They need a plan that includes looking at load reduction, that extra insulation in the walls and the roof, the better performing windows, then looking at energy efficiency and low carbon, then looking at so changing your heating and cooling equipment from fossil fuels to electricity, typically. Then looking at renewable energy to generate and offset some of your on-site carbon emissions. And then finally looking at carbon offsets, such, what was it called? The AEC, someone help me out, the acronym,
Alternative compliance payments.
Thank you. So that could be a type of carbon offset as well. But as I mentioned already earlier, load reduction, you want to do load reduction first, because that means you need a smaller boiler or a smaller heat pump in your building. But if the windows are only 5 years old and the walls are going to last another 30 years, but hey, maybe the roof is due for replacement in 5 years, we can look at replacing the roof. But the other things, it gets harder to look at. The financial case gets harder to replace things before they get their end of life. Next slide. So this is just an example of that particular project, Amoeba building I showed you. These are all the contemplated carbon reduction measures. We looked at walls, increasing R value in the walls, and better windows, triple glazed windows, fixing the roof, doing air tightness to reduce that infiltration, looking at the plant, converting the boiler to air to water heat pump. Also looked at the ground source heat pump, demand control ventilation, energy recovery on the ventilation, and also putting PV on the parking lot and on some of the roof of the building. So these are all the things we looked at. Next slide. But then we had to walk them through, well, when does this happen? Again, most buildings don't get an opportunity to do everything at once. Most buildings need to come up with a plan over time. We kind of identified 3 time periods for them, sort of right now, 2020 to 2030. What could you do? Other things were due for renewable in 2030 to 2040, and then some later on in 2040 to 2050. And sometime, and when some of these passed, we actually went and upgraded the windows now, even though the windows weren't due to be upgraded yet. Or we did the installation now, even though the walls weren't ready to be upgraded yet. Just to see what that would look like in the financing. Next slide. And we gave them a cash flow chart, and this is what it would look like in the financing. And so the yellow line is kind of the worst case. It just everything's negative. And that's when we did all the enclosures now, even though they don't need to be replaced now, which means we're taking the full financial hit of the walls of replacing upgrading the enclosure now. And then putting in the air source heat pump, and then putting the PV in later. And blue is doing the heat pump now, and doing other things later, and so on. And so we kind of put this cash flow together for them so they can make their decisions. Next slide. And this kind of shows, well, all the different combinations. What was the end result? So the dark red is the greenhouse gas emissions intensity in kilograms per square meter per year. Currently, a lot of emissions, all of these are cutting their emissions by about 80%, just different, in that long-term path. But in the red numbers on their bottom are just the different net present values to get there. And they actually chose not the lowest cost, which is D. They actually chose themselves A1. They wanted to get their enclosures upgraded in the future. So it's slightly more expensive for them, but once they started including things like a price on carbon, the cost started to make sense. So once you include the ACP costs, then that's your financial leverage. Next slide. You can stop there for questions.
Right, any questions from the review board?
Yeah,
Okay.
how did you get an air source heat pump to work to heat the building?
The newest air to water heat pumps work down to -5 Fahrenheit now.
And the building can be heated with low temp hot water?
Yeah.
So the building had enough radiation or
Yeah,
spin tube or-
the building was already designed to work with condensing furnaces, so they were already heating with 120 Fahrenheit.
That's one of the biggest challenges with old buildings.
It is one of the biggest challenges with old buildings, yes.
Mhm.
And of course, if you replace all your perimeter radiation with low temperature, you're spending an awful lot of money not to get any energy savings. You're only enabling the heat pump.
Yeah, and very disruptive to the
Yeah.
occupancy.
The flip side is if you could, and not every building's going to be able to do it, but if you know to go from 180 perimeter radiant to 120, you're roughly cutting the heat output in half. So if you could double it, if you could cut the heat losses out the enclosure in half, everything works.
Steve, can you talk a little bit more about the influential factors that drove like the final decision making? Obviously, cost was considered, but were there any other project limitations?
The costs
constraints?
were a big one for them. Comfort was as well. They really wanted the triple glazed windows to deal with some comfort issues they were having. And they were looking in a context where there was going to be a price on carbon soon. And so that was another factor they were looking at. The price on carbon that's being considered is $300 a ton.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on? All right. All right. So let's.
Hi, this is Hannah. Sorry, I know I'm not the intended audience, but I do have a question just for
yes,
a
please.
clarification question for anyone watching this back. On the slide, you talked about the differences between electric resistance and heat pumps, and I'm wondering if you could just explain what the difference of those technologies are, and why they have different outcomes.
I need a graph for that. Well, heat pumps are aptly named. They move heat from one place and from one place to another. So an air source heat pump is actually literally taking heat out of the ambient air in the wintertime when it's, 10 Fahrenheit outside, removing that heat and pumping it into the building. And because it's only moving heat, it can do it very, very efficiently. Matter of fact, typically we can move between 2 and 3 units of heat for 1 unit of electricity operating the pump. And then you may have heard of ground source heat pumps. Ground source heat pumps are taking the heat out of the ground. Because the ground doesn't get that cold, it's even more efficient. So you could be moving 3 to 3.5, sometimes even 4 units of heat for 1 unit of electricity consumed from the grid. Electric resistance heating is literally heating up the hot water. Anyone have an electric stovetop? That's electric resistance. You're heating up a wire till it gets hot. And you get 1 unit of heat for 1 unit of electricity. So that's why there's a difference. And it's going to take, you're going to need a much cleaner grid for electric resistance heat to start making sense from a greenhouse gas perspective. It is low cost to install, especially in the new building. Could be a little more challenging in an existing building. It's a lot of wiring. And then a big cost you're going to come up, a lot of existing buildings will come across is, do they have the electrical capacity to do these electric conversions? Because then you're looking at replacing the switch gear and maybe the transformer, and that switchgear and transformer typically has a 50, 60-year life cycle. They don't need to be replaced that often. So that may be one of the challenges some of the buildings will have if they can't electrify easily without upgrading their electrical capacity.
Good question. Thank you, Hannah. Are there any other questions from the review board or department or anyone else online? All right. All right, so let's look at some of the BERDO groundwork. So the goal of BERDO is to reduce Boston's contribution to climate change, obviously. So buildings covered by BERDO represent approximately 5% of all buildings. And in Boston, they account for about 40% of Boston's total emissions. So Boston BERDO requires large buildings to reduce emissions over time by setting emission standards, which building owners must comply with annually starting in 2025 and 2030. So all buildings are expected to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And so what BERDO encourages, what we've already started to learn about here today, is retrofits, energy efficiency improvements, fuel switching, and renewable energy generation in local buildings. And with those improvements, we're looking at downstream effects of improving thermal comfort and indoor air quality for building occupants, reducing outdoor air pollution, promoting hiring and development of green jobs, and then directing further investments into low carbon equitable Boston. So what exactly is an emission standard? This is also known as the emission limit. This is referring to the regulated amount of climate polluting greenhouse gases, which we learned I'm really talking about carbon here, allowed to be released by BERDO buildings into the atmosphere. So we can see here on the right-hand side of this chart that there's various types of buildings identified, different use types. And overall, these buildings will reduce their emissions over time, roughly every 5 years, demonstrate some reduction across those 5 years in order to reach those net zero emissions by 2050. And some of these building use types have higher average emissions for some building types than others. And knowing what we've learned about buildings as a system today and some various energy sources, I'm curious if anybody would like to chime in and share why they think emission standards vary. Does anyone want to share an example of why some of these emissions limits for some building use types are much higher than other use types? Steve, what do you think?
He?
Yep. Yeah.
Well, no, even if the buildings were, say, insulated the same way, ventilation's a big driver, and how much fresh air you need, and that's different between an office and, say, a residential building. Residential buildings also tend to have much more domestic hot water consumption, so that that tends to push their GHGs up because they're typically burning fossil fuels to do so. Food sales and services, that includes restaurants. Restaurants have big fume hoods to extract all the smells out of the kitchen. That has to be replaced with new air that needs to be heated and cooled. So that tends to drive their energy use up. Healthcare, just the ASHRAE 170 vent code requirements for dealing with ventilation and mechanical systems tends to cause a lot of reheat. So cooling and heating simultaneously in the building, that pushes that energy use up. Really, it comes down to buildings are all unique by their program, and that program can move their energy use and therefore carbon emissions around quite a bit.
Jack, you came off mic. Did you have something, or off mute? Did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, did I? Well, I was going to say operating hours. A hospital's occupied 168 hours a week versus an office building at 50 hours.
Yeah, certainly.
Agreed.
Any questions on this topic or any examples to add?
I would just add, oh, sorry, this is B. We do have a number of like industrial buildings in Boston, and so they each have unique services that they provide with unique needs, and sometimes unique equipment. So just just reiterating that it's all dependent on the.
Yeah, they may not even fit in this bucket you gave them.
Awesome, thanks, Diana. Okay, so knowing every use type has a standard limit there. What happens when buildings have multiple uses? How does that building approach their compliance? That's when we might start looking at the flexibility measure of the blended emission standard. What that allows is it considers the use of the various building areas relative to its square footage and provides an area weighted opportunity to demonstrate compliance across different standard limits. So as an example, say we had a multi-use building that had 60% multifamily, 25% in closed parking, and 15% retail. So it'd simply just take the square footage aspects of those areas by the standard emissions for those use types. And here it's looking at the percentage of that area and then multiplying it out and coming up with a blended emission standard for that particular building. So this is one way in which flexibility measures can be used for compliance. Not something that the board has to weigh in specifically on this flexibility measure, but one way that buildings can demonstrate compliance. So when we start thinking about compliance steps from the owner's seat, we have a small overview today just to start thinking about how a building owner would walk through a compliance process and how they might be looking at various challenges, what might impact them, so we can better understand how to make decisions when reviewing flexibility applications. So a building owner would first need to determine their compliance requirement and their deadline. So compliance would be looking at, are they residential or non-residential, looking at their number of units and square footage relative to just the compliance requirements. And then once determined that they need to be demonstrating the compliance by a specific year, they would look into the emissions reporting process. And they would start with the BERDO reporting form. They would collect energy and water use data and then populate their Energy Star portfolio manager account, which would collect all their building specific information, all the data about their energy use and water usage, and pull that all together so that they could submit that to the department. And then at that point, they would have the opportunity to clearly be able to identify what their energy use is and the corresponding emissions using the appropriate emissions factors. So how a building might comply if they have, they might demonstrate compliance immediately if they are under their standard limit for their building use. But they might also need to look at other ways of complying so that they can bring their building within compliance. One of those options is to reduce energy use in the building. So we're going to focus most on this one today, and then options 2 and 3 and flexibility measures, we'll touch on those today, but those are primarily going to be our focus for the next time that we meet. So in option 1 here, this has the potential to be the most impactful way to reduce a building's overall direct emissions. And that's because the building can undergo a retrofit and general improvements to reduce energy use at the source. So knowing what we've learned about this system, another question for you all to drop your answers into the chat. What are some ways to specifically reduce energy consumption in a building? We've talked about quite a few today, so this is a bit of a recap. But one example would be reducing heating and cooling demand by reducing unintentional air leakage across the building enclosure. So we learned that old windows can be air leaky. We might have other unintentional airflow, which might create drafts and require us to provide more heating for our building in cold winter months. But there's lots of other examples. All right, not seeing any yet, but that's okay. We can definitely take a look at some options here. So this is the same illustration that we saw earlier. Hang dry clothes. There you go, reducing your energy consumption. I like that. This is the same illustration that we saw earlier. Here we have some solutions to how we might improve the energy efficiency of or change possibly behaviors to reduce the overall energy demand and reduce emissions. So some of these examples include things like hot water. So upgrading to a more energy efficient and electric hot water heater. That might be one solution that a building could take a look at. Installing new appliances, Energy Star appliances that are electric and more energy efficient than what they might already have in the building. Induction stoves is another example. Steve's already talked a fair bit about switching to heat pumps and electric resistance heating, all electrically powered systems there. Temperature controls, obviously this is just regulating heating and cooling loads to a greater degree, installing more efficient lighting systems, this weather stripping and sealing. This could be anything from weather stripping and sealing a window to doing kind of an overhaul to provide a whole building air barrier on that building so that it has better controlled, less leaky air leakage across the building enclosure. Window upgrades, various window treatments, even small things like blinds with reflective finishes, those types of things can reduce overall heating needs. And then roof upgrades, solar energy and improving insulation. So a lot of this looks at improving the overall building enclosure to reduce those external loads from impacting the environment and heating and cooling needs, or generating on-site renewable energy to help offset those direct emissions that we have on site. All right, and as a building owner, there are many factors that a building owner might endure when they start looking at how to improve their building, whether it's a simple retrofit or more substantial retrofit. There can be a number of factors that might cause barriers that might be unforeseen in improving a building. And so when we start reducing energy in a building, let's have anyone can come off mic and give some examples that they think an owner might face in terms of challenges or surprises when retrofitting their building. So I'll give you the first few that our team came up with in advance of training. So one being historic buildings. The limitation of possibly insulating a historic building, covering up interior or exterior finishes that might have historic prevalence. And another might be moisture control. So when we start to add insulation to buildings, we affect the moisture balance of the enclosure. We want to avoid things like increasing the risk for condensation, air leakage condensation, or just generally changing the way that that wall potentially dries. Are there any other examples that or ideas that come to mind for anyone?
The tenant can be an issue.
Yes, certainly. Yes, the people side of things, right? Yeah, disruption. Yeah, potential disruption, I think, is a key factor in all of this as well.
I know for us, Boston's an older city. If you're fuel switching, maybe your building was not equipped. Maybe you need some upgrade in wiring.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so we have quite a list here, and this is, I imagine there's many more that we could be listing out, but as Diana said, so retrofits might require various existing trigger existing electrical capacity issues. So is there enough capacity in the building to electrify various components? Maybe mechanical systems need more space than the current mechanical supply system has capacity for. That could be a room, it could be running ducts through the building, it could be even things like acoustic limitations. There might be structural limitations, various loads. The building might not be able to support new loads that might need to be placed on it, whether that's additional insulation or mechanical systems. There might even be lot line restrictions. So whether, how can you access the building in order to install new windows from the interior or the exterior? If it has to be from the exterior, you might not be disrupting tenants as much, but can you achieve that with any sort of like lot line restrictions and accessibility of that building enclosure? Same goes for insulation or other improvements on the outside. Retrofits uncovering other possibly more major issues. Sometimes when you open a building, you start to find more than you knew about. So possibly structural improvements that might need to happen, other remedial effects. And this plays into what Rashida talked about, the impact to tenants, right? There might be unforeseen impacts on tenants even as you start to open a building and want to ensure their safety during construction related activities. Challenges securing capital expenditures. When we saw that every building system or every building needs a plan example that Steve presented, part of that was looking at the costs associated with each of those options and what was most feasible for that particular building and client. And then contracting and implementation capabilities. Some improvements are more tricky than others. Some might require a different set of capabilities than others, and or just the general implementation, having the right team available to do the retrofit work. All right, so we've touched on reducing energy use in buildings, and should say an owner not choose to reduce energy use in buildings, their option 2 would be to obtain renewable energy. And so in this bucket, we'd be looking at something like opting in for the Boston Community Choice Electricity, which is a municipal aggregation to provide a competitive supply of renewable electricity to Boston residents. It could be looking at things like on-site solar. So on-site or anywhere in Boston that can help support offsetting those emissions. Could be renewable energy certificates, so RECs, or even PPAs, power purchase agreements. So RECs and PPAs, all of these options kind of in this option 2 bucket is what we'll get to talk about during our next session. And then third option would be that alternative compliance payment that we alluded to a little bit earlier. So payment that would go into the new equitable emission investment fund and looks at a cost relative to every metric ton of carbon emissions that a building is above its limits. And then if those options don't necessarily feel like a direct fit for a building owner, then there are the flexibility measures available. And so we've talked about a few of those today. We did talk about the blended emissions standard in which a building can leverage the various uses to come up with a blended emissions based on square footage of use. One we haven't talked about yet is the building portfolio. So this would be where a building owner can basically apply a similar concept as blended emissions, but to multiple buildings within their portfolio. So taking advantage of possibly more energy efficient buildings to help offset other less performing buildings. A third option would be the individual compliance schedule, in which the owner gets to establish their own baseline within a specific allowable year. So they would be looking at reducing their emissions overall. So roughly half of that by 2030, but would still need to reduce down to a net zero value by 2050. But this would allow a building to kind of have its own path in reducing its emissions based on a unique starting point. And then the last would be the hardship compliance plan. So allowing a building to come up with a unique plan for compliance, which might be a unique standard limit and reduction over time. It could be a single building or possibly multiple buildings within a portfolio, but trying to give flexibility there in terms of hardship and need. So next time that we meet, we'll talk more about those option 2 compliance opportunities, as well as we'll continue to talk about flexibility measures all throughout our full training. Before we wrap up today, we've got some time for a few more questions in a quick feedback session, and then we can share more about our next meeting on the 24th. Are there any questions from the review board or the department or anyone else online relative to any of the topics that we talked about today?
Yeah, just to jump in, I'm just curious what you've been seeing with respects to community solar programs and how, you know, they've been sort of shaping up in Boston. Because one of the things that I've been curious about is, you know, whether tenants could sort of petition for community solar as a co-op in the city of Boston. And I know we have the SMART program, but I'm just curious from your perspective or your industry perspective, how viable or how much are you seeing that happen, recognizing that there's not a lot of space in Boston for solar to go, but I'm just curious what you're seeing so far.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't have the best feedback on that right now. Is there anyone else online that might be able to weigh in on some of the effects that Stephen's asking about?
Yeah, I can jump in.
Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, so I would say we haven't seen a ton of community solar in Boston. But there are like more. I think like I've heard of more initiatives to try to get more community solar stood up across Massachusetts, and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, from the federal government has new solar tax credits that have rolled out over the last, I don't even think it's been a year. And so that is also changing kind of the equation of solar financing across the country. So I think we may see some changes in kind of the solar market. I would say that from like an ease of adopting renewable energy, that aggregation programs like the one that Boston has of the Boston Community Choice Electricity tend to be like the easiest for tenants and small electric customers to take advantage of, because you can get, you know, mass class 1 RECs, high quality renewable energy, without a lot of effort. Like the city is going and procuring that on your behalf, and that's an easier lift than even trying to, you know, pull together and find a community solar project to sign up for.
Thank you for sharing that, Hannah, because I hear it come up a lot in conversation, and so we try to push the community choice electric. And I think it's one of those topics where residential tenants, because I do believe commercial tenants tend to have a little bit more say in how they want to retrofit their space, or especially if they're a tenant of the entire building, what they choose to update. But as Board Member Boyd pointed out earlier, the tenant piece tends to be a little bit difficult when it comes to like weatherization and trying to update, you know, the envelope of their space, whether or not they know what that looks like, and sometimes a tenant may not even have the ability to even manipulate their thermostat. I'd love to get a smart thermostat in my, you know, residential unit, but it's not something that's allowed. And so I mainly ask sort of these questions to see how we can better work to not only inform the tenants, residential tenants of our community, but also, you know, make it much more feasible for landlords to either, I don't want to use the word relax, but maybe I should use the word relax certain aspects when it comes to tenants wanting to better make their space more of a low carbon space, so to speak. So thank you for that on the community solar, but I am also curious about the way that we can go about communicating for other things beyond community solar as well.
Yeah, I would just add quickly, this is a very big topic of conversation in the discussions around the 3-year plan for Mass Save, which is they're reviewing the draft 3-year plan that will run from 2025 through 2027 for Mass Save right now. And there's a lot of discussion around how do we better serve renters, and a lot of that is through you know, working more with landlords and providing different incentives for rental buildings. So we are trying to push also from Boston to make sure that the plan is kind of providing the most
that MassSafe works as best as it can for rental buildings as well, knowing that it's an extra hurdle many times to get those measures taken.
Did this just start?
No, the 3-year planning process, I feel like it starts, I can't tell you exactly when it starts, but it's a very long process. It's like
Okay,
almost
got
like
it.
they're constantly planning, but I can find the link to the draft plan that is under discussion right now.
Okay, I would love to see
Share
that. Thank you, Hannah. I have no further questions.
One question, just because we're in the spirit of this exercise, and thinking forward as new members join, they may watch this recording. Hannah mentioned Mass Class 1 Rex. So I didn't know if we wanted to explain what that meant, Hannah.
I can do that. So Mass Class 1 RECs, a renewable energy certificate, is a REC. And that is the documentation of the environmental benefits of renewable energy. So they can be bought and sold, and they have a value to them. Mass Class 1 RECs are in Massachusetts. The certain definition of kind of the highest quality renewable energy that is from New England. And so that is what, through the Boston Community Choice Electricity Program, the city is procuring additional Mass Class 1 RECs on behalf of customers of that program. Customers of that program are residents of Boston who are paying an electric bill.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Diana and Stephen. Any other questions? All right. We do have a quick learner survey for the review board members online today. If you could, we'll go ahead and just take it now. It's a quick 1-minute survey. So you can scan this QR code, and I apologize, I do not have the link right now. If you are unable to scan, I can send it after the session so that you can provide feedback. And what we learned from this survey is information that we'll be able to apply to future training sessions. So this will give the feedback that we need in order to continue to improve the training and to build out some of the technical topics that you're hoping to learn about, and will inform the continued development of our plan.
Sorry, Bailey, one clarifying question. Should the department also take the survey, or is this
you
for the
are
board?
more than welcome to. Yeah. If for those on the call today from the department, you are totally welcome to as well. Anyone is welcome to add their information. I believe it will collect your contact information so that we can parse out who is from the review board, the department, as well as that. And I am working on getting a copy of that link right now for you. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Lynn, behind the scenes there. All right, and when you're done, let's have folks do a quick hands up to let us know that we're good to move on. Thanks, Rashid. Nope, that's all I needed. You're good. All right, link is, oh, that's for the 3-year link, Stephen. That's the, okay.
Oh, let me try to get a different one. Sorry about that.
All right, folks, we'll go ahead and move to wrapping up today. So our next steps, we'll meet again on June 24th during the public meeting. And at that time, we'll get more in the weeds on the purpose and steps of an energy audit, when you might undertake an energy audit and what exactly is a part of the audit and what that leads to, how it informs a building's plan. We'll describe why every building needs a decarbonization plan. Steve did a really good intro with a case study today, but we'll get a little bit more in the weeds on what that plan looks like and how it could be used to demonstrate compliance over time or to support various needs for flexibility measures. We'll start defining, we'll define what district energy systems are and start talking about PPAs and RECs, which we had a little bit of a glimpse of today. So we'll talk more about that next time. And then just a reminder, the 3rd and 4th weeks of July, we will have small cohort training. You'll be receiving more information for that next week. So we'll be identifying who will be in which small group cohort and scheduling the best time for everyone to be able to join. So we'll have more information for you next week on that item. And that is the end of our formal training. Are there any questions for our team as we wrap up today? All right. Well, thanks everyone. We appreciate the opportunity to deliver training today.
Well,
Thank you.
Bailey, and thank you, Steve, from RDA.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. So is there a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
A second.
On the motion to adjourn the meeting, board members in favor say aye.
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 Ayes have it. The motion passes. This meeting is adjourned at 6:20 p.m. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good one, guys. Later.
Thanks everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
good
Take
night.
care.
You all.
Bye.
Bye.